This is one of scores of city parks in Buenos Aires, Argentina's capital. At any time, day or night, you can see, or at least smell, the whiff of marijuana, the use of which is widespread in this country. The police usually turn a blind eye. In fact, last year, the Supreme Court ruled that it was unconstitutional to punish the personal use of marijuana, stopping short of legalizing it. The move is part of a broader recognition spreading throughout Latin America that the so-called drug war has failed and that it's time to come up with a plan B. It's 40 years old, and the so-called drug war has aged badly. When it was declared, Colombia controlled the trade and most of the production of cocaine. Peru and Bolivia grew the coca leaves. The consumers were in the United States and to a lesser extent Europe. Today, almost every country in Latin America and the Caribbean is either a producer or a transshipment point for drugs. They've also become consumers. Peru is competing with Colombia for first place as the #1 producer of cocaine. And Mexico's drug lords now control the most lucrative and violent part of the trade, getting the goods to market across the border into the United States. But the horror movie-style violence and corruption is not limited to Mexico. Neighboring Guatemala is fast on its way to becoming a narco-republic. And the nearly daily gun battles in the slums of Rio de Janeiro, Caracas, even Buenos Aires also have their roots in drug trafficking. The scope and intensity of the violence is shaking the very foundations of the decades-old premise that illegal drugs can be controlled by force, giving way instead to a debate about whether they should be legalized. 3 former Latin American presidents of Mexico, Brazil, and Colombia are proposing legalizing marijuana, which accounts for 60% of the multi-billion-dollar narcotics business.
In the case of marijuana and cannabis, what we think is you have to decriminalize the whole thing.
Cesar Gaviria waged a fierce battle against the Medellin cartel when he was president at the height of the drug war.
If you don't help...
But in an earlier interview, he told me that he's come to realize that the only way to win it is to put the cartels out of business instead of locking up consumers. A message directed especially at the United States.
They recognize that the policy of the war on drugs is failing. What happens is they are not ready to change the policy. They don't have an alternative policy.
The alternatives, however, are only beginning to be discussed openly by regional policymakers. Earlier, I spoke to Alberto Calabrese, who compares the current situation to the 1920s, when alcohol was illegal.
The world is applying rules that were first invented in the 1920s to impose prohibition on alcohol. It was unsuccessful back then because it made no sense and the law had to be lifted. It favored clandestine business and organized crime, and even encouraged many to drink simply because it was banned. The drug war so far has been ineffective. We know that barely 10% of what is consumed is confiscated. In any case, becoming an addict or not is very relative. Alcohol, by the way, is also technically a drug, and which causes as much damage as the worst narcotic substances.
But certainly drugs like crack cocaine or heroin are much more addictive than alcohol.
No, perdóneme, pero el alcohol tiene un grado de adicción muy severo.
Excuse me, but alcohol has a severe degree of addiction, very similar to crack cocaine and heroin, because it uses the same neurological reception channels as opiates. Therefore, alcohol addiction is as severe as opiates, such as heroin and morphine. So to say that alcohol is a soft drug is not true. It is more difficult to treat alcohol addiction than crack and cocaine, because the latter causes psychological addiction, while the opiates also provoke an intense physical dependency.
Do you think that drugs should be legalized? Do you think that's the solution?
I can't say that so categorically, because since there is a consensus of the majority, if not all the members of the UN, to prohibit these drugs, which, by the way, I think has had a negative result. Obviously, it would take an international agreement, not just one individual country. There are some more liberal than others, more considerate of the needs and rights of addicts. But for now, drugs are presented as the #1 problem of humanity.
Is this a kind of all or nothing proposition where every country has to agree to legalize it or no country can do it?
No. A menos que se decidiera, no, y yo creo que un solo.
No, I don't think a country can do it individually. All the others would attack it, led by the dominant position of, obviously, the United States. They would seek a consensus to push that one country that broke the rules of the game, arguing it's breaking international agreements. Now, it's interesting that marijuana in the country that is the #1 consumer, the United States, is so prevalent that it's gone from being produced in 2 states to 16 states. Yet they don't eradicate a single gram. We don't see mass fumigations or burning of marijuana. Eradication is done by hand. There are about 40 million habitual marijuana consumers there. All this means that there is a certain degree of tolerance, a kind of let's look the other way.
Clearly, there's no consensus about whether to legalize or liberalize the use of illegal drugs to make it a less profitable business. It is very controversial. But in Latin America, as in the United States, it's something that's being talked about more and more. And those who argue that it's just a matter of time say that policymakers are waiting to see who will take the plunge and lead the way. Lucia, Newman, Jazeera, Buenos Aires.